you're right, there's no bigger subject. That doesn't elevate me, of course, but it's an inescapable one. Religion ends and philosophy begins, just as alchemy ends and chemistry begins, and astrology ends and astronomy begins. I think you would be surprised in turn, actually, to find out how many people don't believe and are annoyed by religious bullying and theocratic bullying and intimidation, not just in this country but around the world, everywhere from Iraq to Afghanistan to Somalia to the settlers on the West Bank to the people who want to teach nonsense to our children in schools. The evidence is, when Americans are spoken to seriously about this, that they're not completely credulous. They don't take everything on faith.
And which obviously we know where you stand on religion, we know where you stand on Reverend Falwell. By being so angry about what his legacy was and is, are you not hurting his family and others who may have no dog in that hunt, but who would just like a few moments to celebrate his life and have some peace?
Well, I don't care whether his family's feelings are hurt or not, but if they are, they can take comfort from the extraordinary piety and stupidity and, generally speaking, uniformity of the coverage of the man's death. It is, after all, was said by the supposed Jesus of Nazareth to his followers that they must expect to be mocked for their beliefs, because their beliefs will appear to many people to be ridiculous, if not worse than that, and that they are to take it for granted that they will be ridiculed. That's true, I think, of the most devout and serious and thoughtful Christian, but for a vulgar fraud and crook like the Reverend Falwell, it's an obligation to say what one thinks about him, or be left off the air and have people like yourselves broadcasting only piety. And that, well,
whatever, I'm not broadcasting only piety. I did my radio show, and now we're having you on here to talk about your view.
Yeah, but now you're having me on, and then arguing that maybe it's bad taste to have me on. I don't think.
Well, I thought it was a legitimate question, because I think people are wondering.
Yeah, well, I've answered it. I've answered the question.
You have, and I will now move on to Ralph Reed. Now that you've answered that question.
Christopher, I'm not sure if you believe in heaven, but if you do you think Jerry Falwell is in it?
No, and I think it's a pity there isn't a hell for him to go to.
What is it about him that brings up such vitriol?
The empty life of this ugly little charlatan proves only one thing, that you can get away with the most extraordinary offenses to morality and to truth in this country if you'll just get yourself called reverend. Who would, even at your network, have invited on such a little toad to tell us that the attacks of September the 11th were the result of our sinfulness and were God's punishment if they hadn't got some kind of clerical qualification? People like that should be out in the street shouting and hollering with a cardboard sign and selling pencils from a cup. The whole consideration of this horrible little person is offensive to very, very many of us who have some regard for truth and for morality, and who think that ethics do not require that lies be told to children by evil old men. We're not told that people who believe like Falwell will be snatched up into heaven, where I'm glad to see he skipped the rapture, just found on the floor of his office, while the rest of us go to hell. How dare they talk to children like this? How dare they raise money from credulous people on their huckster-like Elmer Gantry radio stations and fly around in private jets as he did, giggling and sniggering all the time at what he was getting away with. Do you get an idea now of what I mean to say?
Yeah, no, I think you're making yourself very clear. I mean,
This is probably going to be the most simplest one for you to answer, but what if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you'd been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. I mean, there's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which, by the sheerest accident, you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
think about the personal, because you have said that you believe that those people with religious belief who impose their religious beliefs on their children are in effect responsible for a form of child abuse. You called it very wicked.
I would like I would like children as far as possible to be allowed to think for themselves. So, for example, to label a small child, a Catholic child or a Protestant child or a Muslim child, that I think is wicked, because the child is too young to know. And just to give you, I've used this illustration often enough before. If I said to you, that's a Marxist child, or that's a secular humanist child, or that's a Keynesian child, you would look at me as though I was mad. How can the child be a Keynesian child? And if I said to you, well, both its parents are Keynesians, you see what I mean? Religion has a free ride to label children with the belief system of its parents in a way that nothing else does. An economic system doesn't, political system doesn't, nothing else
But
does.
the fact is, and this comes back to this idea that you're unfairly picking on religion, the fact is that children are assumed to inherit many different values from their parents. It's not just religion,
that's right,
it's
but they're not
modes of
actually
behavior, it's attitudes to sexuality, all sorts of things.
Yes. So suppose you take ornithology or something like that. It's perfectly reasonable to expect that, say, the child of Peter Scott will be an ornithologist. That's perfectly...
No, but let's not pick something which so obviously is a hobby. Let's pick something like attitudes to outsiders, to foreigners, people not within the tribe, the nation, or the group.
So let's use the label xenophobe for somebody who is automatically hostile to outsiders. And would you say that a child of parents who you know to be xenophobic or racist, say, would you say that's a racist child? Of course you wouldn't. You'd say that's a child of racist parents.
Whether you term it a racist child or not, the odds are that child will inherit some views.
Entirely different matter. That's an entirely different matter. That's an empirical matter which may or may not be true, but you're not giving the child a chance if you label it a racist child.
Well, you're not, but the labelling may not be something that goes deep into the consciousness of the child. If the child is still, as you were, I must say, you were raised as an Anglican, and you were confirmed, you went to church.
So what?
But the point is, your parents didn't stop you from thinking about other ways of looking at the world.
No,
you were labelled a Christian boy.
Nothing to do with my parents. That was school. I was sent to Anglican schools. But still,
So you were labelled an Anglican boy.
Sure I was.
But it didn't stop you imbibing lots of other knowledge about the world and seeing the world in your own particular way.
Well, of course not. As it happened, and it happens often enough, that lots of people manage to break free from whatever it is they're labelled as. But let me come back to the example you raised, which was the idea of a racist. Now, you made the point, which is a perfectly valid one, that a child of racist parents is actually quite likely to be a racist child. But you wouldn't dream of labelling a child a racist child. You'd think that was truly wicked to say, this is a racist child because it's... And if I challenge you to say, how do you know...
Forgive me, and I do want to move on, but perhaps I'm misunderstanding something. You seem to be hung up on the labelling. I'm saying, leave aside the labelling, but the fact is, there are many things that children inherit from their parents, one of which is religion, but there are many other values, good and bad as well. Why pick on this idea that it's so evil for a child to inherit religious beliefs from its parents?
Specifically the labelling that I'm talking about. It's just like the feminists raising our consciousness about sexist language, about saying one man, one vote. And now the feminists picked on language, and you could say, well, it's trivial. It doesn't matter. Language doesn't matter. But it does matter. And the feminists demonstrated that. I am picking on language. I do think it's wicked specifically to label children. I have never said that it's wicked to bring children up in a particular belief. So, of course, children are going to learn from their parents. That's why I used the slightly frivolous example of ornithology. We could take racism as well. Of course, as a matter of fact, it's likely to be true. Actually, it's less true than many of us think. But as a matter of fact, it may well be true that children do inherit beliefs from their parents, but don't label them a racist child or a Catholic child or a Marxist child.
Stop making that big face!